eminent historian Charles Allen, who has a special connection with India, will discuss his latest book with historian, author, and translator A R Venkatachalapathy. Ladies and gentlemen, a big round of applause for both of them as they come onto stage.
Good evening, Vanakkam. It's my pleasure to be here discussing the book with the distinguished historian Charles Allen. His new book, Coromandel, A Personal History of South India. I was wondering when I was invited to be in conversation with Charles Allen, I was wondering why a professional historian who has at best sold 2,000 or 3,000 copies of all his books put together has been invited to be in conversation with Charles Allen, who has probably sold tens of thousands of copies of his book. Wow. Because I myself have bought many of his books. It was a pleasure to read your book on Buddha and the Sahibs, God's terrorists, parts of your book on Kipling, and your book on the mountain in Tibet. So from the mountain in Tibet, he has now moved to the Podige Hills in this book. So this is a professional historian, academic historian, pitted against a popular historian. Welcome to Chennai, Charles.
Thank you very much indeed. It's a wonderful pleasure to be back in Madras, Madrasapatnam. And I have to say, well, a couple of days ago, I was talking with a friend who happens to be Tamil in London, and I said, there's this guy called Venkatachalapathy who I'm going to be interviewed by, and he said, oh my God, he's a great historian. And I thought, I'm sunk. I'm sunk because, for a start, I try not to call myself a historian. There's myself and a great friend of mine called John Kay, and we try to call ourselves writers of history because we are the guys who plunder the work of the real historians. They do the work, we then plunder their work as far as we can, and I'm sure sometimes we miss out an awful lot, and try and make that, dare I say it, more accessible. And so I think we have a role, but we are parasites.
I tend to be soft on anybody who writes a nice chapter on the Tamil language. You have said some nice things about the Saint Agastya and the Podige Hills. So, there is a popular view that the pilgrimage circuit is not complete. If you just go to Kashi or Varanasi, you have to come back to Rameswaram. So, looks like after making a career of writing books about mostly set in North India, Burma, and even Sri Lanka, you have at last turned your eye to the South. Yeah. So that really warms our heart. So how did you start? Why did you write a book on the South in the first instance?
Some of you will know that I'm a Topiwala. I'm the last of the Gorolog. I'm a fossil. My family have been involved in India since 1790 onwards. We have graves all over India. We have a stake in India, but we are not of India. We are there. We've been here essentially to make a living for ourselves, and we've gone home to die in Cheltenham. And that is if we can. But I have members of my family buried in the Khyber Pass. I have them buried in Colombo, etc., etc. So we do have a stake in India, and I am a child of India, and therefore, do I have a right? Do I have a right to write about a country of which I am not a member? And I think this is a hot subject at the moment. Should only Indians write about India? Should only Tamils write about the South? But I think if we do that, we get a very narrow, focused view of history. But I think there's a real danger about people like me writing from a foreign perspective. On the other hand, I think we can bring new insights in, and I hope that's what I'm trying to do here. And you ask, why do I write about the South? All my life, early life, has been in North. I'm a Kanpuriwal. I was born in Kanpur, and my family had been there for generations. Exploiting the resources and exploiting the people in the sense of whether as merchants or missionaries, whatever it is. And I think their contribution has been in some way minimal. But nevertheless, I know nothing about the South. So I've written this book for the worst possible reason, which is that I know nothing about the South. Therefore, I wanted to learn about the South. And whether that's a good reason or not, I'm not sure.
In your preface to your book on Kipling, you say that you are born to write his biography. You are born to write his biography. Yeah?
Yeah, I mean, some of you will know that my family were intimately connected with Rudyard Kipling. My great-grandfather was a newspaper proprietor. He owned some of the most powerful newspapers in India. And in a sense, I was horrified when I saw that Alan Octavian Hume called him the worst sort of Englishman in India. In other words, he was very opposed to the Indian National Congress and so on. And he used his newspapers to oppose any moves towards nationalism. And so you can understand that people like myself have had to go on a very, very long journey to try to understand, to unravel our views on India and so on. And alas, there's still a great reluctance in Britain. I think that statistic I quote, that I think 62% in a poll, YouGov poll just a few years ago, 62% of British people think that the empire was a good thing, that it was actually, a force for good. In other words, following the Curzonian line. Curzon said, "Oh, the British Empire, the greatest force for good the world has ever seen." And he goes on to say, "The sacredness of India haunts me like a passion." And he goes on to say, it's only when you get to know the strength and greatness of India that you realize that she is, only when you get to know India do you realize that she is the strength and greatness of India. And then he goes on, "Therefore, the cords that bind us together must be drawn ever tighter." And I think that's what we try to cling on to. This whole idea of loving India but wanting to control it.
Okay. So you were born to write the biography of Kipling. So, but how did you go about preparing to write this book on South India? How did you prepare yourself?
It's again out of ignorance, as I say, out of ignorance. It's a worst possible reason for starting a book. But then I was so astonished that in a sense all our history comes from the north. But here, this is the old India. This is the rock upon India. This literally is the rock. This is the Indian plate. And in a sense, this is a rock. This is the solid rock. The north is the alluvial plain. It's the detritus from the great Tethys Sea that flowed down through this mighty river, this kind of Uba Ganga, which flowed across the great plains of Bengal. 6 miles of sediment. So in a sense, this is the old India. And indeed, when we look at the people, we look at your origins and all the latest figures, when you look at the new science of looking into origins, looking at our genes, we can see that generations of immigrants, because every single one of us were immigrants. We're all immigrants out of Africa, but at different generations, different times. And we get these waves of people working their way along the coast and round and up again and on as far as Australasia. And each wave brings a new generation. But those waves are settling in the south. And therefore you can understand why the language here is so profoundly different from the language in the north. So in a sense, this is the original India. And that I clung to that in the sense that the Dravidian language. And you can see that at one time the Dravidian language extended far north. I don't know if you know, there's this phenomenon of the Dravidian languages. There's a tiny little group of Dravidian speakers right up near Persia, near Iran, called Brahui.
Balochistan.
Yeah. And so what are they doing there? Well, there's one theory that they're immigrants from the south. But that's actually nonsense, because there are little pockets all the way in the middle as well. How did they get there? Because basically they're the survivors of the advance of Sanskrit. So to some extent, this book is also not exactly an attack on Sanskrit, but a wish to remember that the Dravidian culture has a great deal going for it. And I was thrilled to start looking at works like Thiruvalluvar, for instance, Thiruvalluvar. Works like that, you know, it was, I wish it had been today, but yesterday was the auspicious day of the great poet Thiruvalluvar. And he's a humanist. We use the word in India secular. I don't like the word secular. Let's use that word humanist in the sense of human values being as important as religious values. And therefore in the sense that, so all the values that Thiruvalluvar promotes are essentially humanist values. Respect for your elders, love your neighbor, be tolerant, be kind. I love him for that. And you could say, all right, he was a bit of a patriarch. You know, he's saying, wives, you've got to obey your husband, which is the negative side. But nevertheless, we forgive him for that.
Yeah. Well, very interesting that you should mention the Brahu language, which is spoken in Balochistan. This would warm the heart of many Tamil enthusiasts.
Yeah.
But you also mentioned that the south is solid rock. But you say certain things about the Lemuria, which is not going to win much support from Tamil enthusiasts here.
Yes, that's true. I wanted it before I go on. The other thing which I want everyone to try and read, I was thrilled to discover, just to carry, can I carry about the whole idea of the secular values? Because the other thing that I discovered in this process, because for me, I've been on a journey of discovery. And if my brain hadn't been starting to give up on me, I would have spent another year. But Purana Nuru, does that mean anything to anybody, the Purana Nuru?
It means a lot to us, many of us here.
Go back and look at this early verse that was coming out of the south. We call it Sangam literature. And it's part of that complex ideas that there was this culture in the south which accretes around this word Sangam, assembly. And here were poets who didn't write about the gods. Now, if you look at northern mythology, and goodness, it's wonderful. The mythology that you've inherited, that you've adopted, can I say that, if you're a Tamil, is from the north. It's wonderful. The mythology of India is so vast. You know, when I compare it with Britain, we've had to borrow all our mythology from the continent. We have no mythology of our own. You know, our religion is basically, you know, a Jewish religion. We've had to adopt foreign mythology as our mythology. What have we got? We got Robin Hood. Here they have the Mahabharata and the Ramayana and thousands of other stories. Every village has its stories, and we haven't got that. But I think there's a danger in this. If all your mythology is religion-based, then surely, and the fact is you see it repeated time and time again on Doordarshan. I mean, I think the Krishna stories have been told, are there 220? This constant process, as I see it, of hearing the mythology of India repeated and repeated and repeated, particularly if you're a Dravidian, I wonder whether it possibly overdoes and overlays the humanist values of the South. So that's something I've clung to as a humanist. We are deeply irreligious in the UK. I think unlike America and unlike India, we are no longer a religious country in that sense. And so for us, that's another feature I have to deal with. This is a deeply religious country, and I have to be very conscious of not upsetting religious sensibilities. I've talked
even though you have certain warnings in the preface of your book about people with a religious bent wanting to read your book. You're basically telling them don't read the book.
Yeah.
We'll come back to that in a little while. But you do make, you have a very interesting phrase in your word, in your subtitle. You call it a personal history of South India.
Yeah.
What is this personal?
I would have liked to have called
You
this...
also mentioned the fact that, you at least 2 of your forefathers served in the army here in South India.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's true. I mean, yes. When I talk about my family, when I look at issues like, I was very astonished to come here and to talk about things like, go and try to understand, let's say, the meaning of Tipu Sahib. Now that's, Tipu Sahib, we're very grateful to him in my family because he helped to make our family fortune. One of my ancestors, at the age of 18, he was the youngest British officer at the Battle of Srirangapatnam. So he was involved in that, and we have a letter which says that night, I was put in charge of the treasury. and I had to stand there all night long with my hands resting on bags of gold, with 2 pistols and a candle. And, but he, as the youngest ensign there, was given prize money of the value of £1,000 then, which is something like £400,000 today. He was the most junior officer present. So the senior, so in other words, a lot of the families of England are loaded with the booty. There's no other word for it, the loot of Srirangapatnam. And you say how outrageous this was, and then you say, well, hang on a minute, where did Tipu get all his booty from? Well, it's from raiding Kerala. I mean, let's be honest also about Kerala. I was astonished to go to the south and speak to he was a car dealer, but he was a huge enthusiast of Tipu Sahib. He regarded him as a great hero, and he said, this is a great patriot, you know, this guy. He fought against the British. He actually inflicted the first major defeat on the British. He imprisoned all your officers. And indeed, one of the great trophies in England is Tipu's tiger. Are you aware of Tipu's tiger? It's almost the most iconic element in the Victoria and Albert Museum. And it was Tipu and his hatred of the British being celebrated with this tiger, which, if you wind it up, it goes, ah! And you get this combination of tiger roaring and British officers screaming as he's attacked and killed by the tiger. And this was actually the son of the general, who happens to be called Munro, which is part of my family. So there's one of my ancestors being killed by a tiger, Tipu's tiger. So Tipu was a great hero in the south. And I said, well, yeah, but come on, he made 20,000 Nairs, circumcised them. He persecuted the Christians. Why are you making him a great hero? And I think this is part of the ambivalence that we have about, you know, the British in India. Yes, it was a great looting operation, but when, having got rid of Tipu, did we make life better or worse? And I think this is the big debate.
So from the subtitle to the title itself, you say that the title has some sentimental value for you, right? Coromandel, the ring of it. So why did you choose to describe South India?
My publishers, Coromandel.
By the Coromandel, which is only a part of the
exactly,
eastern coast.
And I think it's very confusing for everybody. This book is called Coromandel, and Coromandel comes from Cholamandalam, as I'm sure you all know, and it's the Portuguese who actually used the word first, and in the changing it to Coromandel, and then the British picking it up. And now in England, my publisher said, but what's Coromandel? And he looked it up. There's some poems by, in the land of Yongi Bongi Boo, Edward Lear, in the coast of Coromandel. There's a place in New Zealand called Coromandel. There's a Chanel perfume called Coromandel. And everything except what it is, which is a word that everybody, in the English originally, Coromandel and Malabar were the 2 great words that described the east and the west coasts of India. And they were, of course, the source of all that early trade, the spices and the cotton and the silks that right from the time of the Romans, you know, all over the south, there's Roman gold. All over the south of India, people are finding these hoards of Roman gold. And we get the Roman historians complaining about the fact that India, which was then, of course, the richest country in the world, was draining all the resources of Rome with all its gold. And that trade, of course, that's the great lure that lured people like my ancestors to come here. You know the famous phrase, shaking the pagoda tree, the idea that the pagoda was this golden coin, and the idea that they would come here and make a fortune. Well, most of them didn't. As you know, they died here. They 2.5 years, the average expectancy of the European in India originally. 2.5 years, so not surprisingly, most of them drank themselves to death. Sorry, so it's all irrelevant what I'm saying. But
so you have used Coromandel to describe the entire South India. You have covered 5 states, more or less 5 states. Vishal Andhra, Tamil Nadu, Kerala, Karnataka. So I want to ask you why you didn't deal with Maharashtra at all.
I wish perhaps I should have called it Tamil, a voyage of discovery, or an attempt to understand the Tamil South. The word history, of course, is so loaded. As I say, I'm not a historian, I'm a writer of history. But nevertheless, this is my attempt to understand the South. I wanted to call it the Orientalist view an Orientalist discovery of India. But Orientalism is another word that has so much baggage with it today. I don't know if that's something
I will take you up on that very shortly. But why you didn't take up Maharashtra? I want to persist with that question. Because Maharashtra shares so much with the Dravidian South.
Well, my answer to why
it falls between the two
why
stools.
is there nothing about Maharashtra? And of course, it's like Maharashtra, Orissa, or Odisha, as we must now call it. There are these two states which are kind of borderline. They're so influenced by the Sanskritic culture, and they don't, they're much less Dravidian in that sense, but nevertheless, I write a lot more about Odisha than I do about Maharashtra. My excuse is that I have written about the Satavahanas. I wondered if that name means anything to anybody. The Satavahanas, the great culture that took over from Ashoka's empire. Does that mean Andhra? Andhra means something now, in the sense of Andhra Pradesh. There is this great culture that flourished there, which and there's a most wonderful excavation has taken place at the very uppermost branch of the Krishna, right in the wilds, really. Some engineers were coming along to open up a new dam up there. And there was a big mound there, and they excavated. And this is a place called Kanagalahalli, which is now coming into the light. It's one of the last surviving, it's not complete, surviving stupas from the Buddhist era. And it has the most wonderful, very large bas-reliefs in marble from the Satavahanas, who were the great rulers of the Deccan and South India, really from Ashoka's time, the end of the Ashokan Empire, right through to about 250 of our era. And so for a long time, they were tolerant. I love them for being tolerant. They accepted all religions, they patronized all religions, and they welcomed all religions. So we get Jain and Buddhist cultures flourishing alongside the growing Hinduism, which is developing out of Brahmanism. And so we get popular Hinduism developing there, but at the same time we get the last real burst of Buddhism in the north. And so you get these wonderful frescoes. So there you can see the Satavahana kings. They produced the first coinage with images of rulers. And so I think there's got an awful lot, and I hope that people will learn to study them. So that's my excuse. My contribution to Maharashtra in terms of culture is not the destructive one that many people associate the rise of the Maratha power, which in the north was very destructive, as you know, but is basically the Satavahanas. That's my excuse.
Very interesting excuse. You seem to be fascinated by archaeological finds. So you give extensive space to archaeology in your book. You talk a lot about Airavada Mahadevan's work. And you have also used your own work on Buddhism in this work. You're drawn from that work.
Yes, I think
what fascinates you about Buddhism?
We have this, one of the extraordinary discoveries that I suppose
call it the single biggest discovery.
Yeah. In trying to understand the early history of India, because as you may or may not know, I made my name as a historian of the Raj, the British Raj, as an oral historian. That's how I really made my name. And after a while, I got absolutely sick of going on and on about the British in India. And I thought, here is a country so rich, of which only 200 years, that's much less than the Mughals. Why do we concentrate on this particular period when there's such richness to be discovered about which so little is known? And you go into this and you discover that it's not only me, it's the Indians who don't know about their history. That there was this great Buddhist civilization here, and that Buddhist civilization was more or less wiped out by the rise of Hinduism. Now that's right and proper, that's what happens in history. But it was also a process by which they were actually literally written out of history, because who are the historians? They're the intellectuals. Who are the intellectuals? They are the Brahmins. And the Brahmins, as you know, were opposed by going right back to Buddha Sakyamuni in the fifth or fourth, if you like, 4th century BCE. He is one of those brave intellectuals who stands up and says, hang on a minute, let's question orthodoxy. Why is it that we have to give everything to the gods? Why do we have to accept things as they are? Why do we have to accept the intellectual authority of one group of priests? And so for the first time, it's not only the Buddha, it was also Mahavira, the founder of Jainism, Gosala, the founder of the Ajivikas. We don't know who the Ajivikas are, but there were various cults at that time, all of them Kshatriyas, who for the first time challenged the religious authority of the Brahmins. And Buddha famously in one of his sutras, he writes about, you are not a Brahmin by birth, you're a Brahmin by your attitudes and by your beliefs and by your behavior. And this is iconoclasm, this is heresy. And so, of course, the Buddhism was very much frowned upon by the orthodox Brahmins, and so literally it was written out of history. And so one of the astonishing things for me was to find that Ashoka, the greatest emperor that India has ever produced, of huge influence throughout Asia. His influence is huge if you go to China, if you go to Sri Lanka, where Buddhism has survived. That Ashoka was literally written out of history. And it wasn't until these foreigners, as it happened, it could have been Indians, who discovered these monuments and actually decipher them and realize that this strange writing that no one can understand, we call it Ashoka Brahmi or Brahmi, that this secular writing was the work of an emperor called Ashoka. And then gradually, the history of early Buddhism in India became apparent. And now, of course, we accept it. But in the South, who knows about Buddhism in the South? Who knows that it was the Jains coming to the South, who greatly actually brought their culture, who brought literacy. Now, there's a dispute about whether it's literacy.
Can I read out a line from your book?
Where does the first written text come from? Does it come from the Northwest? Does it possibly come from Sri Lanka and the South? Because there's a huge debate going on at present. And my great hero, Iravathan Mahadevan, and others, I have to say, when I do this kind of research, as crude as it may be, I'm so dependent, as indeed, my heroes are the British Orientalists and the German Orientalists. In other words, these foreigners who got thrilled, as I see it, who wanted to understand Indian culture and examined it and translated it and published it, and all of whom had Indians at their shoulder who get written out of history. These were the scholars who stood, these are the Brahmin priests, these were the what's the word, we would call them, they were called translators, weren't they really? They got no credit. And for me too, it's the work of Professor Iravathan Mahadevan and others that I've had to draw on, and indeed great Sanskrit scholars. My great guru happens to be a German, because there's this wonderful tradition that maybe you're going to challenge me on Orientalism later, I don't know.
I think this is the moment to challenge you on Orientalism. You celebrate Orientalists unabashedly. It's more than 30 years since Edward Said's book was published. The politics of Orientalist knowledge has been laid bare. What is your defense?
I don't know how much that will mean, but in 1978, this Palestinian Christian called Dr. Edward Said brought out a bombshell, a book called Orientalism, which said that basically all the scholarship that foreigners, that people from the West had involved themselves in studying the East was bogus because it was overridden by colonial, that it was an attempt to control and to manipulate and to diminish Indian culture, Eastern culture, Oriental culture. And this had a devastating effect on academic studies in the UK. I was at SOAS at the time. I was attached to the history department. And I can remember the furore, which basically said no Westerner should study anything to do with the Middle East or Iran or Indian studies. It should all be the work of local people who know what they're talking about. And as far as I'm concerned, this is a travesty. Now, I know that Edward Said knew an awful lot about the Levant, Palestine and so on, because that's basically his speciality. But he knew nothing about India. He really didn't. And he got it horribly wrong. I mean, he actually misquotes Sir William Jones, who's my great hero. He's even here they acknowledge him in India, the father of Indology, the father of Indian studies. The guy who comes out to here and says, we are going to study Asia in all its aspects. And we're not just going to study, we're going to find and publish and translate and make available to everybody. And for me, this is a huge contribution to Indian studies. And my answer to those who say Orientalism is a colonial process is to say, what about Germany? In India, India has had something like 100 great German scholars. Now, you can't say Germany had a colonial stake in India. But from Professor Max Müller onwards, right to my own guru, Dr. Harry Falk, the great Ashoka specialist, these people dedicated their lives to understanding, in Harry Falk's case, Ashokan inscription. He's the great expert on Ashoka Brahmi, early Brahmi. And to call these people colonialist exploiters of India is an outrage, in my view. So I've defended that in about 4 books, and I'm sorry to say I'm doing it again.
Isn't this a caricature of Edward Said himself? Okay, you have a picture in the book where an European presents a picture of an elephant and some Indians. And you have a note which says that, this is obviously the work of a person who has neither seen an elephant nor Indians, right? So, how would you respond to that? I'll get the picture in a while.
Can we have a look? Is it one of my pictures on? No.
It's a picture in the book.
Incidentally, part of this celebration of Indian culture, I don't know if you saw at the beginning, I had a kind of loop of various pictures. Now, alas, this is part of the looting of India. These are all in your office library or the V&A or the British Library. Nobody looks at them. Wonderful explorations of Indian culture that are unknown here. And
I've got the smoking gun. It is
yes,
page
yes.
260.
No, in that sense, no, of course.
You have a picture and you say the French illustrator had obviously never seen an elephant, never mind an Indian. So these were the people who for the most part were producing knowledge about India.
We all, I think, I'm talking about those who actually have some knowledge of India. So much nonsense has been written about India by foreigners, and indeed it works 2 ways. So much nonsense has been written about Europe by Indians, and that is because a lack of knowledge. And that is partly what this journey has been about, is to try and understand. But I think that illustration is a very good example of somebody's half-baked, half-understood knowledge. He heard about these people called the Nayars, a very fascinating group of people from Kerala, as you know. They were the great warrior peoples of the Malabar coast. They were the bastions. They were the equivalent, you might say, of the Rajputs in the north. These were the warrior people who lived by a certain code of ethics. The Spartans, you could almost call them. In many ways, so admirable in their austere ways of life, and who had all sorts of peculiar practices, including their bizarre sexual habits. And the sexual habits, of course, the Europeans latched on. And they got terribly excited to find that the Nayars had unusual sexual practices involving the women were the women who the women controlled fertility, the women controlled sexual access, etc. And so the Brits got terribly excited about this, and the Europeans thought, this is a kind of sexual paradise. And so there was this kind of place, people like Voltaire and Shelley got terribly excited that here was a kind of paradise because there was sort of sexual freedom for the men. Oh my God, 15 minutes to go. I'm going to stop rattling on.
So we need to give time for Q&A, but I'll come back to a few other issues. Orientalism once again brings us back to the question of sources. And I see that you started by saying that you pillage the work of academic historians. I would like to say that you have not pillaged the work enough.
I think
You have relied so extensively on 16th and 17th century Victorian and pre-Victorian sources of dubious veracity and quality.
well, here we get down to this debate about history. And this is something that as I've grown older, I've had to keep changing my views on how valuable history is. And I hate to say this to a professional historian, but basically every single one of us brings baggage. I bring my whole colonial baggage with me. I can't totally get rid of it. Yes, I came here in the 60s as a kind of hippie, and I got thrilled by the spiritual India as I saw it at the time. This was the great, all the gurus were here, all the godmen of India were here, and it was the age of the Beatles coming out here, and that was part of my early life. Yes, because I did go back to the 60s in my 20s. So for me, I suddenly had to discover a new India, and then I had to rediscover my whole attitudes towards India. But as I go on, I find that historians are just as vulnerable as I am. And I talked about the Saidian influence. It wasn't Edward Said that I criticized. He had the right to say whatever he wanted to. But it was the unthinking following of him and unchallenging acceptance of his ideas. And the one thing I start off at the beginning, I'm going to quote one, I have a great, if I have a guru here, is Professor Romila Thapa. I don't know if you know her. She's now in her late 80s, we think might even be older.
88.
And she's been an influence on me really all my life in terms of studying. And yes, I'm outdated, absolutely outdated. The younger historians I find in Britain today who are writing about India are, as far as I can see, entire slaves to to Edward Said's view of history. That colonialism is so overrides everything. But I have to say, as a historian, do not believe what any of us say. And I'm going to quote you Romila Thapa. She's speaking to her colleagues at JNU this is 1999, and she says to her colleagues, remember to be very cynical. All historians, when they put out theories, have an axe to grind. Now, whether it's they have Hindutva views or in my sense, Orientalist views, we are all deeply suspicious. Do not believe a word we say until you have read it and challenged it and looked at other opinions. And the tragedy is that we are now accepting history as it comes. Anyone we read, we think, oh yes, that's truth. There is no such thing as truth in history. There are only viewpoints. We are all vulnerable human beings. And with all due respect to the people whose feet I would touch, in terms of their scholarship. Yes, I have drawn very largely on outdated, outmoded sources, partly because these are people that we've forgotten about who made a huge contribution to Indian history and are being written out of Indian history, but they were pioneers and they happen to be British. But remember that it was the British who brought historiography to this land. We in that sense, the one great contribution that Orientalism, you could say even the colonial process, the one great contribution is not railways and the law and the English language and schools and whatever it is. This is what I call, what did the Romans ever do for us thesis. All right? That's not important. What to me is new thinking, breaking the shackles of the past. And this actually is if you go back to the original definition of Aufklärung, the Enlightenment, the Age of Reason, the original definition is precisely that. It is about abandoning fixed ideas and thinking for yourself. And that's what I think Orientalism brought to India in its greatest contribution. The idea that people should think for themselves and not think because your professor says this, he happens to be right, with all due respect to all professors in India.
Before I throw open the floor for Q&A, what is, having written this book on the South, what do you think is distinctive about the South? Or is it distinctive at all?
Yeah.
Having spent a lifetime studying North India.
It's a revelation to me, frankly. I wish I'd had I wish I'd come here earlier to the south, because there is a totally different atmosphere in the south, and I find it incredibly refreshing. And when I know we've tried, as far as possible, not to challenge things, but there are some bad things happening in Britain and in America and in India, and they all come about this idea of overriding facts for theories. My opinion is as good as your fact. And the great promoters of this, I hate to be blunt about it, the Hindutva movement is destroying Indian democracy. And luckily, to me it's a terrifying thing, because we saw it happen in Europe in the 20s and 30s. We saw it happening in Italy with Mussolini. We then saw it happening in Hitler. We've seen Trumpism. We've seen people like Farageism in Europe, by which, literally my prejudices are of equal value to your scholarship. And I think that's incredibly dangerous. And for me, the bastion, and it goes right back to the Sangam age, the bastion of the South is that there is this liberty of thought here in the South, which I hope will prevail. And the idea that reason is what something is judged on, not on the basis of faith or imagined faith. I don't want to diss faith, in the sense we all have a right to our own religious thoughts and our own religious values. But to say that the state, in some way, must declare what particular... This is going back to the medieval Europe. We had this problem with our religious wars, which destroyed Europe for generations. I'd hate it to break out here in India. And so I believe this with a passion, and I hope in the South that this will be that bastion of liberalism and humanism. And I hope people will see that, which is why in this book I should have written about the South, but I've had to write about the aberrations, because the Hindutvas are rewriting Indian history in the North. They're making up claims which are entirely bogus about out of India, the out of India theory, the idea that the Aryas are the inheritors of the great civilization of the Indus Valley. But if anybody has a claim to it, it's the people in the South. It's not the Aryas. This is not to do... I have enormous respect for the Aryas, the great thinkers of the world. Here were intellectuals who came up with most wonderful ideas that were way in advance of Europe. But nevertheless, you've got to also see the other side of that, which is eventually, if you corrupt that process, you end up with the Hindutva movement.
Charles, you have written a good book. I hope, like your forebear, who made a lot of money in Tipu's army, you will also make a lot of money with this book. And this book will command a good sale. On that note, let me throw the floor open for questions.
Mr. Allen, could you throw some light on what your views are on Francois Courtier's theory that there is no such thing as the Aryan and the Dravidian?
I don't know what to say. He was entitled to his theory. I only argue that how do we account for this extraordinary difference that one belongs to a language family which extends from Finland to Scotland, all the way across even into Central Asia, and indeed a place like Iran and so on, and another culture which is distinct in itself, which has a language which is utterly, utterly different. I don't know how you explain that, except in terms of... Some people would argue that, people change their languages, but they don't. It's almost the most fundamental thing. Also, if you look at things like genes, now there's been a lot of work on this, on haplogroups, for instance, and you can see that particular group. Has anybody had their DNA tested? I've had it tested, and I was astonished to find that my closest relatives are from Poland and indeed Iran. What's that about? It's the fact that I belong to a haplogroup called DRNRR, the number's in the book, that I happen to belong to a group which is shared by many North Indians, particularly in places like Kashmir, Iran, obviously. And so these are basically the fragmented Arya. We are people who had a common origin, and this is where I dispute what Edward Said is. We in Britain and the Arya had a common origin somewhere in Central Asia, going back to about 10,000 BCE, where we were cattle drovers and sheep herders, and the Aryas had these two great inventions which swept across: the horse, riding the horse, or using the horse, and the chariot. These are the two secret weapons that they brought into India. And they're not there before. They're not there. You cannot find one, two bogus attempts to join. You know, when you look at the great, what do we call it? The Indus seals. Can you find me a horse? You find me a war chariot? No. They're the secret weapons of the Aryas. They would have been there. Also, there's a huge gap of 1,000 years. A huge gap when nothing exists here in terms of buildings and so forth. Account for that, except in terms of the collapse of one civilization in the north and the arrival of a new one. The Aryas bring a very, very distinctive culture, this wonderful language and so on. Go on, I'm talking too long.
Yeah.
So that's my answer.
I don't know if this is intentional, but there seems to be a subtext that there are two countries here. There is a North India and there is a South India. Historically, that is right. I mean, we all have our pet theories. But do you think today these are two separate cultures, I mean, rubbing shoulders with each other? Because you're from neither the North nor the South. So how do you see it as an outsider? Have they not fused completely? Because they are two different cultures in many respects.
I think you have, I understand what you're saying, and I think here the two of us would disagree to some extent. It seems to me that the whole Sanskritic culture, by which I mean Brahmanism, arrived in the South really very late. There's no evidence of it in the early days. There's no evidence of it. And when we look at what's going on in the North and what's going on in the South, it does seem as if, you know, this is quite a late arrival. The very fact that we don't seem to have, that the early culture seems to be Jain, so much of that early writing, the Sangam work, seems to have Jain influence. You know, there are things like no sacrifice, various virtues which you don't find in Brahmanism at that time, where blood sacrifice is a major feature. Remember that blood sacrifice more or less got cleaned up in the 19th century during the great Hindu revival. I mean, there was a great reform movement going on in India. People like one of my great heroes, Swami Vivekananda, and others who were basically cleaning up Hinduism and saying, you know, let's get rid of all these nasty things in it that really don't appeal to the West. I mean, he is the great guy who more or less coined the phrase sacred India. Our vision in the West of India, the sacred India, is so much based on people like Swami Vivekananda and his great campaign to spread the idea of Hinduism in the West. So I completely off your subject. I forgot even what you asked me.
I'm glad that you made the distinction between a historian and a writer of history. But I did get this narrative of romanticizing that narrative of history, which is very common in most writings of empire, of colonies. How do you think a genuine effort is being made to de-romanticize this whole narrative of India from the Western mind?
Can I just explain that I think I am totally out of step with modern historians in Britain. But I also think that I ask you to remember again, it's a rap, it says, okay, remember again, I'm not saying that my history is right, and I'm just simply challenging their history. And I want everyone to do that. Challenge history all the time. Yes, I accept that I may be horribly wrong. What you may read from me may be complete rubbish, but give it a chance and ask, and then apply your own faculties. We should always be critical, and I'm very much critical of some of the younger British historians in their attitudes about. We are suffering from this huge colonial guilt among our historians, not the populace, but the ordinary. But the ordinary people, I'm sorry to say, have no idea about British history. They think it's still Curzon's India. They think we did a hell of a good job in India. They didn't see it as a huge process of exploitation. They didn't understand that.
Thank you very much for putting things in proper perspective. You said, if I heard you right, we have no mythology of our own. Am I right? Have you heard the theory that Jesus, as a young boy, was brought up in Kashmir and he learnt quite a lot of Vedas. My point is, had he come down south, the history of Christianity would have been different.
Do you want to say something about that?
Yeah, I mean, this is just one of the wonderful things, you know, St. Thomas and so on. I wish you, I've given you a very polemical view of what I've written. I mean, what's wonderful is the way that we get all these traders coming in. You know, this was the great place of refuge. I think of the Persians, you know, the Irani, the Zoroastrians to whom you gave refuge, the Jews to whom you gave refuge, the Syrian Christians who came along here and settled here. And I think of that wonderful culture of welcoming these people, the Muslims who came in, the traders, the Moplars as well, or Mapulas as they should be called, the Mapulas, and their contribution, you know, we've written women out of history, we've written the Muslims in the south out of history, you know, we've written the Adivasi out of history, they're just not there. And most of our history here is about that great underclass that, alas, is so hard to understand because we've got so little material from it. But I want people to understand that other element. In a sense, the South has welcomed foreigners, and I think that's a wonder. Yes, I'm not saying the Portuguese paid them back with equal kindness, as you know. They brought in that nasty element of viciousness within their religion that, alas, other countries also brought in. But alas, sometimes that's what happens. Faith becomes distorted. But Hinduism, one of its great virtues is the virtue of acceptance and tolerance. And indeed, whether that comes from Ashoka or whether it comes from the Jains or whether it comes from Hinduism itself, this is the great virtue of India. And it's something that, above all, I love. And I have learned so much from this land of my birth. And even though I sound as if I'm dissing it, that I'm being negative about it, it's simply because I believe passionately in this wonderful country that has given me so much joy and pleasure. Lizzie and my wife and I have been walking over India and visiting sites and taking tea by the roadside, you know, with chai wallas and visiting the villages, and never in my life have I had anything stolen or never had any violence. No one's been rude to me. And you wouldn't get this anywhere else. I'm so grateful to India, the land of my birth, and this is my way of saying, this is my darshan, if you like. This is my way of saying thank you, and I hope people see it in that light.
Thank you, Charles.